Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating, highly complex political theory from a recent deep dive analysis. This source material tries to draw a straight red line connecting local New York congressional elections, all the way up to global think tanks, and then right back down to the writings of a long-dead philosopher. It's like a giant puzzle. Whether you're a political theory junkie or just kind of curious about how different factions view the modern world, this breakdown is going to give you a clear map of the arguments being made. Let's just jump right in.
Okay, take a look at this explosive quote highlighted right at the beginning of the source material. Originally posted and then quickly deleted, actually, by a university group linked to a newly elected official, it really sets the stage. The analysis unpacks recent upset victories in New York's congressional primaries by candidates tied to the Democratic Socialists of America, or DSA. Now, while a lot of mainstream outlets painted these wins as, standard grassroots politics or a push for basic economic reforms, the thesis here suggests there's a much deeper, far more radical motive at play.
Section 1, the New York election trigger, framing a local win as a cultural revolution. So, to really understand this theory, we first have to look at how these local election wins are framed by the source. They're not seen as isolated events, but literally as the tip of the spear in a massive cultural revolution. The source points to the DSA's actual platform to make this case. You see, the public sales pitch, stuff like transit improvements, rent freezes, taxing billionaires, the author views all that as just surface-level messaging. Because when you dig into the internal platform, the goals are breathtakingly vast. We're talking about abolishing the U.S. Senate, defunding the Department of War, granting amnesty to all immigrants, and essentially replacing the president and the Supreme Court with bodies subordinate to Congress. The argument here is that the objective goes way, way beyond just tweaking the economy. It is literally aimed at dismantling the foundational structure of the U.S. Constitution. And that brings us to the real core of their local analysis. The actual target isn't economics, it's the culture. The premise is that these candidates didn't win just by, knocking on a few doors right before Election Day. Not at all. Instead, they succeeded because the DSA has spent years quietly building what they call a hegemonic counterculture. This is framed as a multi-generational effort, taught in schools, pushed by media-savvy professionals, designed to attack the very foundations of American culture, from traditional family structures right down to the history of the American Revolution itself. Which brings us to Section 2, Gramsci's Cultural Revolution Theory, the intellectual foundation. Right, so where does this strategy like building a hegemonic counterculture actually come from? Well, the analysis completely bypasses Karl Marx to focus on an Italian communist named Antonio Gramsci. Let's look at his arc. In 1926, as the General Secretary of the Italian Communist Party, he was arrested by Mussolini's fascist government. By all accounts, the guy should have just faded into obscurity in that prison cell. But instead, over 11 years, he painstakingly wrote 33 handwritten notebooks. That's over 2,000 pages. The author argues that these specific notebooks are exactly what successfully revived Marxist theory after the original Russian model completely failed to spark global revolutions in the West. So, here is the crucial point. How the theory defines Gramsci's core strategy. Gramsci allegedly realized, hey, you can't just seize political power by force if the citizens still firmly believe in their national culture and civilization. The revolution has to happen in the culture first. According to the analysis, Gramsci argued that you have to make the people actively hate their own civilization. You have to hollow it out. Once that culture is completely destroyed from the inside out, the actual political takeover, well, that just becomes a mere cleanup operation. The explainer explicitly links this historical theory directly to the modern educational programs of the DSA today. Moving on to Section 3, the global elite connection, strange bedfellows. This builds right into the most surprising and, honestly, the most complex claim of the whole piece. The idea that wealthy global elites are actively utilizing these exact same Marxist theories. It sets up this absolutely fascinating paradox. Think about it. On one hand, you have the revolutionary DSA leveraging Gramsci to dismantle Western culture. But on the other hand, you have the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, literally the absolute pinnacle of the wealthy globalist establishment. The thesis points out that the CFR is also quoting Antonio Gramsci in their recent essays. So the big question is, why on earth would the anti-capitalist street-level left and the billionaire establishment class both use a dead communist prisoner as their guiding reference point? To answer that, the analysis dives into historical precedent, outlining what they call the British Imperial Network playbook. The claim is that elite networks historically protected and funded Marxist theorists. And not because they actually believed in communism, obviously not, but because these radicals were highly useful weapons against geopolitical rivals. I mean, Karl Marx himself was famously hosted in London and funded by wealthy industrialists to target Russia. Similarly, Gramsci's ideas allegedly survived prison only because a Marxist associate in Cambridge was sponsored by Lord Keynes, a man fiercely dedicated to preserving the British Empire. So the core argument here is that the global elite have this long history of deploying radical theories from the top down to weaken targeted nations. Which brings us right back to the modern day and to the CFR. The explainer points out that a CFR senior fellow recently opened an essay planning for a post-Trump world, using this exact famous quote from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks: "A world where the old order is dying and the new cannot yet be born, and a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." The premise here suggests that the CFR views the globalist system as the order that absolutely must be preserved, and they frame Donald Trump and the populist national movements he represents as the literal morbid symptom that Gramsci was writing about. Section 4. Targeting the American system, the ultimate goal. Now we've reached the real climax of the theory. The author identifies the ultimate target that supposedly unites these completely disparate groups, the street-level revolutionaries and the boardroom elites. They posit that what really brings them together is a shared threat, and that threat is the revival of the American system of political economy. According to the source, this system is defined by things like reindustrialization, sovereign manufacturing, tariffs, and a foreign policy deeply rooted in the dignity of individual nation-states rather than global institutions. The theory argues that Donald Trump represents the most serious revival of this specific economic system in generations. And because this system is inherently designed to foster national independence and a culture of optimism in building, it supposedly poses a deadly existential threat to the globalist financial system centered in places like London. So with all that said, what's the counter-strategy presented by the source? Well, the author argues that simply complaining about modern political divisions or, pointing out the radical nature of the opposition, it just isn't enough. To defeat this multi-front cultural attack, they say there must be a conscious, deliberate revival of the American productive spirit. They argue for actively cultivating a future-oriented culture, basically a culture reminiscent of historical eras of massive industrial growth, one that is so fiercely optimistic and so busy creating a better future that the Gramscian tactics of generating cultural hatred simply fail to take root. They just bounce right off. We're going to end this explainer with a question for you to reflect on, drawn right from the heart of the source material we've just unpacked together. When analyzing our current political landscape, how much of what we see on the news is driven by truly organic, grassroots disagreements, and how much might actually be driven by the deep, hidden intellectual architectures and historical playbooks described in this analysis? It's a really heavy question for sure, and a deeply complex theory, but understanding how different groups view the chessboard is absolutely vital for anyone trying to navigate the modern world. Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive into the political red thread. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I will see you next time.